So we are live for our general government meeting. We are not, at this time, have a full quorum for discussing legislative matters, but I'm pretty sure Jim will be here probably 15 after.
Since we don't make a decision.
As long as you don't make any decisions. So you can go ahead with the discussion. You
Okay.
just can't conduct any business or make any formal decisions.
Yeah, I don't think
which
we
you're
were
not
going
planning
to.
on anyway,
No,
so
it
we're
was,
good.
it was just informative. So, and I have to say that I'm pretty excited that this informative discussion revolves around reducing, 27 pages or something down to 5. That's really awesome for simplification. But we'll go ahead and start that discussion and invite Patrick.
Roll call.
Oh, after the roll call, we'll invite Patrick to take over the conversation.
Councilmember Dennehy?
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez? Absent. Councilmember Jaquez? Absent. Councilmember Meisner? Absent. Councilmember Reed? Absent. Councilmember B. Smith?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick?
Here,
Mayor Smith?
Here. All right, Patrick, thank you for being here. Can you give us some background
Certainly.
behind this and all?
So, first of all, good afternoon, Madam Mayor and members of council. What we are going to discuss today are some provisions to amend Chapter 1717 in our code concerning the PDD, Plan Development Zoned Districts. Now, I know we've had recent conversations about a full, comprehensive amendment to all of Title 16 and all of Title 17. This is not that. We can have a conversation afterwards about where we are in that process. We're currently drafting an RFP, and I believe there's some grant money that we can go after, and we're thinking about potentially partnering this with an update to our comprehensive plan, but we can lay some of those details out after we've had this conversation. So as you know, the PDD zone district is a form of customized zoning. And as we learned last fall, the PDD zone district that we currently have has some flaws associated with it. So what you're seeing right here is a flow chart that represents kind of in a very broad context the outline for how the land development process happens, from the general to the specific. And in this case, the general starts with zoning and or rezoning of property. The idea is that zoning is what will establish the rules for the property, all of the height and bulk limits, the use requirements, what are any sort of discretionary uses that come with the property. Then you get to, and the city of Canyon City, by the way, does offer a number of what we call Euclidean zone districts for residential purposes, commercial purposes, and then also we have some overlays on top of those. But the idea is that those are sort of prefabricated zone districts that the code says, all right, if you want this zone, this is your lot size, this is your height limit, these are the uses you can put on it, etc. Now, the next step in the process is typically the subdivision of land. This happens, generally speaking, once the zoning on the property is established, because the subdivision is the step that's going to lock into place the various lots that you will have upon which development can occur, and whatever infrastructure will be necessary to support those lots, assuming that the infrastructure is not already in place to do so. Now, the city does not have a requirement currently that you must combine or do these processes concurrently. And in fact, most people in the development community would prefer not to do them concurrently because the issues that you have to address as you're zoning a property, particularly if it's part of an annexation, are different than the issues you have to address when you're trying to plat a property and create buildable lots. A lot of engineering tends to go into the subdivision step in the process. A lot of conceptual thinking tends to go into the zoning step of the process. And sometimes merging those two processes can have unintended consequences that you really don't want to deal with the engineering part of it at the time of zoning. Now, depending upon the scope of these the scope of the type of subdivision that's going to be created, Canyon City also has a number of different types of subdivision processes that you can go through. From the very complex, where we have major and minor subdivisions, with the sketch and preliminary versus the minor, all the way down to the very simple, a subdivision exemption where you're vacating a lot line or you're splitting a lot into two. All of these processes are defined in Title 16 as options for a developer for how they want to pursue taking a piece of ground and splitting it into viable lots. Now, as I said, the city doesn't require this for any Euclidean zone district or any other property. However, when it comes to the PDD, Planned Development District zoning, that's a different kettle of fish when it comes to the process. What you see here is a graphic taken right out of Title 17, specifically 17.17.001, where it describes the integrated process. You will see it's talking about when you rezone to PDD, you also have to have a PDD plan and preliminary plat for approval submitted concurrently. Then after that, you have to have a final site plan for approval and a final subdivision approval. This differs significantly from, as I said, the Euclidean zone districts and our Title 16 subdivision processes. We do not typically require a preliminary plan and plat for anyone doing any kind of a process that involves an R1 or a C general commercial. This is only applicable to PDD zone districts. Now, this is also requiring that you have to have both a final subdivision and final site plan that are approved by planning area within a PDD zoning area. All of these have to go through public hearings, which again is a time-consumptive process because there are notice requirements that come into play for public hearings. This is a very complicated and somewhat cumbersome process, and I would even offer as a personal observation in my reading of it, the process itself, as written, almost seems like it's intended to serve as a disincentive for it being used. Well, if you're going to have a tool that's so difficult to use, why have the tool at all? Staff is suggesting that what we should do is scale back the PDD ordinance to its essentials, so that essentially what it's doing is giving the developer an opportunity to create specific customized zoning based upon how they want to develop the property. Now, what that means is that when you have a PDD zone, you've got two components that make up the zoning. One is the plan or map that identifies what land use areas you want to create on the property. The other is the guide, or the set of written instructions that contain all of the same information you'd find in Title 17. Height limits, setbacks, permitted uses, discretionary uses. Those two components, when married, create the zoning on the property. And a developer will want to customize that. Now, these are the same type of PDD regulations, what we are proposing in your Exhibit A attachment, that most of the municipalities in the Denver metro area are using, and they've been very popular with the development community because they do offer enormous flexibility. One of the trade-offs that most municipalities have is that, okay, for this flexibility and for you to be able to respond faster to changing market paradigms for what residential construction is calling for, we're going to say that if you do not have a final plat filed for any portion of the ground within your PDD for a period of 3 years, we're going to want you to get your PDD itself recertified and update whatever is in there to make sure it is the most current. Now, developers like this because it gives them the opportunity to change something as they see market demands for various types of housing products change. And then finally, it will then say, okay, once you have got your zoning in place, your subdivision of the property then follows the processes we already have in Title 16. There is no new subdivision process that has no parallel to anything else that we currently do. The subdivision process that we have for anyone doing something in an R2 zone will be the same for anyone in a PDD zone from now on. And then finally, what this does is, as Mayor Smith said, simplify the process from approximately 25 pages down to about 5. So with that, staff is recommending that this will be going to Planning Commission for discussion later this evening. And it will be coming to council for first reading on February 3rd and second reading on February 17th of this year. And that would conclude my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about this, but we're hoping that this is a patch that simplifies the PDD process to make it more universally applicable to property within Canyon City.
Any questions from council? Go ahead, Jim.
Well,
Obviously, I missed your presentation, but
It was a short presentation, so you didn't miss much.
obviously. Uh, You may have answered this, but where's this at in the big picture of 17?
So one of the things that I pointed out is this is intended to be a patch to fix what we have observed are flaws in our current PDD processing of applications. It is not part, it will be rolled into the bigger picture, but the overall comprehensive update to Title 16 and 17 is rolling forward right now. We're in the process of drafting an RFP. We're going after some grant funding. And we're going to try and potentially do this in conjunction with an update to the city's comprehensive plan so that we can achieve something of an economy of scale when it comes to the work we're going to be getting from a consultant on this.
Also having cohesive documents between the comprehensive plan and Title 17. You want those two things to work together.
Absolutely.
Patrick, would you roll back up to the flow chart that you had? And maybe that, I think that really kind of, encapsulates what's going on. And give Jim the executive summary of that.
Okay. So from the general to the specific, the land use processes that the code provides for start with an application to annex and zone or to rezone a piece of property. That zoning is what establishes the rules for how the property can develop in terms of use, height and bulk limits, et cetera. Then we have the platting of the land, which is where you create the viable lots that will support development and any infrastructure that's needed to support those lots. The city has sort of a menu of options for the types of subdivisions that you can go through based upon the scale of what you're doing. Larger subdivisions that are more than 10 acres or more than 5 lots fall into the major subdivision, which requires sketch and preliminary, and then final plat. Minor subdivisions are subdivisions that are less than 10 acres and somewhere between 2 and 5 lots, and then you've got the simple subdivisions, the exemptions. Now, none of that is applicable to a PDD zone. The PDD zone wraps these processes together in a very cumbersome and complicated way. And what we have indicated is we believe it's best if you strip the PDD to make it a useful tool down to its essentials. The rules as part of a development guide for what uses, height, and bulk limits you can have, and then the plan that indicates what areas they are. And that's all. Your subdivision processes for PDD zones at that point become what everyone else, everywhere else in the city must use.
And in a lot of places in the state, that they're using this process here.
Yeah, so go to the next slide, so at least Jim can review that on. Okay, keep going. Like the benefits of it.
Oops, sorry, didn't mean to go that far. So the PDD zone district that we are proposing as your Exhibit A attachment to the staff report, as I said, strips it down to the essentials. This is the same type of PDD regulation that's used by municipalities all over the Denver metro area. And the development community finds that very popular because they can customize their zoning to fit what they see as popular trends happening in development, whether that's for commercial or primarily residential. Residential tends to go through shifts as to what people are wanting to see and purchase. So they can create a customized zoning that maybe our Euclidean districts never really contemplated. You've also got the ability to, at that point, say, all right, now that you've got your zoning in place, your subdivision process will be the same as everyone else's. You're not going to have to go through this specialized process that has all of these complicated steps and requires hearings, not just for final plat, but for final site plan as well. And as I said, it also deregulates this from 25 pages down to about 5.
So you're saying that once they go through this process, this rezoning process, they go through the same building process without having to have any hearings? Is that? Or
Well,
do
they would go through the same subdivision process.
Subdivision process.
So if they've got a subdivision they're proposing that's 100 acres and they're going to create 60 lots and they're going to create 23 lane miles of street or whatever the number is, they would still go through the same preliminary and final plat that they would have to go through otherwise. It's just that this is a preliminary and final plat for a PDD zone district.
So the question I have, so for the development plan and the development guide, are there public hearings required for that?
Yes, it would be processed the same way any other rezoning request would be.
But
The
they're
difference,
together or?
they would have to be together. We couldn't have a
Okay.
complete zoning package without both the development guide and the development plan
So that takes, what was 3 public hearings down to 1?
to one, correct.
The packet says it's 23 pages, and the slide says it's 25 pages currently. What do you think it is?
When I counted pages, it came to about 23, so that I may have just pulled that number out of the air, but yes.
And when you say this is kind of a patch to fix the current PDD process,
Yes.
so, and you said, do you imagine it blending into the new 17, or will that look a lot
No,
different?
we would envision rolling this into the new Title 17. We believe that as a tool to encourage development, this kind of flexibility, where it's fully customized zoning and it's not overly complicated for a developer to pursue, this is where we want to go with the new Title 17 when we move forward with it.
Another question I have is that, like, for example, on page 2, item C, it states design and construction of PDDs shall include adequate, safe, and convenient arrangements. Is that subject to interpretation? Could that interpretation go for or against certain developments? Sometimes we had conversations where it needs to be in black and white, so it's the same for everybody and it's consistent.
Well, it would be subject to interpretation, but what I would say is this. What is adequate, safe, and convenient in most cases is what's readily usable, that it's not creating hazards in and of itself. And I think it's a situation where you know it when you see it, because you're not having streets that, I don't know, have odd angles to them where they intersect. You're not having pedestrian areas having to merge with streets in a dangerous way. These are generally things that, when you see it, you know it's either okay or it's not okay. We try to, as part of the staff review, catch those things that aren't okay and get them fixed before we bring them to Planning Commission and Council.
You know, one way to think about it is, you know, when you have an older development and new development, is that transition smooth between those two areas of the community? Or, you know, do the sidewalks align, do the roads align, things along that nature?
And can you explain more about how the city may require parks, school sites, or other public purposes to be provided by the applicant?
Currently, the city does not have a park dedication requirement. Some other jurisdictions, and again, I reiterate, we took this language from a lot of other municipalities in the Denver area, they do require park dedications, and they have a whole formula written out as to, by size of development, what that translates to in terms of per home acreage of park that you must dedicate. This language was more or less left in there from those examples that we borrowed from. The city doesn't have that park dedication or that open space dedication minimum requirement. So we're not going to go after a developer and say, well, you're creating 500 new homes, therefore you need to create a 6-acre park somewhere within this development. That would be, if council wanted to negotiate that, you certainly have that authority. It wouldn't be something staff would say is mandated as part of that kind of an application.
And is that legal, considering that the Canyon City can't have parks? Would that only be applicable if, well, I mean, we can have parks, but only by election. Would that only be applicable if it was like
no,
an
that's-
HOA and they ran the?
Oh, that rule doesn't, I would not read that in as
Okay.
necessarily applying here.
So that's actually a good point. So should it read rather, right now it reads, the city may require parks, school sites, et cetera. It probably should read, the city may require open spaces rather than parks.
that's a
Yeah,
because
we could
park
put
has a-
open spaces in there. Yeah,
Right.
sure.
Although it would be nice to have more parks in Canyon City,
Well,
especially if there was a 500-house
Let's avoid the
subdivision.
vote, you know.
So if you have a 500 house subdivision, you know, the city has the ability to impose, you know, we've talked about this in the past, exactions of different things. And if you have a 500 house subdivision, I can tell you the school district's gonna come knocking at your door and saying, we want something out of this. You're probably gonna wanna have some open space available, at least to the residents of that subdivision. And, you know, the other public purposes, drainage, stormwater stuff,
Yes.
so it kind of covers that whole gamut. But we can change parks to open space, that's no big deal.
Well, I'm okay with where it
Well,
is now.
but
for-
it helps, that way, if we require a developer to have a park, then we have to send it to the vote of the people, rather than just through a public hearing.
Oh, unless the idea is that that park is going to be owned and maintained by some sort of a homeowners association rather than the city.
Yeah, or a special district or something.
And I'm just
yeah.
saying that if we call it an open space, it makes it clear that we don't have to get into that discussion.
Okay?
Councilmember Meisner?
Well, I've got a question about, a comment about that. I'm just going to tell you generally, I don't like the vagueness of the statement of D saying that the city may require. Like, who is that? I just don't like those types of things in any regulation, and particularly a new regulation in terms of who is going to determine item D. I would prefer to see that say with some sort of council approval, but the city, I just don't like that.
Well, no exaction can be imposed without the governing body of the city, so that means the city. And we can put the city council, but the problem is if we put the city council in there, then it's gonna come to you with none of that worked out, and exactions on the fly in an open meeting are not something I wanna venture down. So if staff feels like, and we're talking about an extreme example here, especially in the open space, I think, I don't see that happening here because, as Patrick said, you don't have that typical park language in your code. You know, if it were to happen, you know, and staff were to say, well, we're gonna recommend some open space dedication here, that decision is ultimately up to council. You are the final decision maker here. And if you say, nope, no dedication, then it's done. But you're the final decision maker.
But the problem is that staff have the freedom and the flexibility under this guideline to require that without any consultation with council.
No, they have the right to recommend it. They don't have the right to require anything. They're not the decision makers ultimately. But they do have, that's what they're there for. They're there to look at something and say, I'm gonna recommend to council that X, Y, and Z happen. And maybe the applicant likes it and maybe the applicant doesn't. But they can still make, that's what they're there for. You're the decision maker. So I would not use the word require when it comes to staff. Staff can certainly analyze something and say, because of these reasons, I'm gonna recommend this.
So are you suggesting that we strike the word require?
No, because the city that's referenced there is you. It's you, as the governing body that makes the final decision. You're the body that's gonna require or not require.
I still don't like it, based on past history.
Which I have to see. Oh, on page 4, item B, number 1, it talks about the staff review with 45 days and going to the city planner and all of that in the public hearing. So start from finish getting through this new PDD process. Best case scenario, how long do you think it would take?
Probably 60 to 90 days tops.
And average, so you say 90 days tops? That
Yeah,
would be.
it depends on how the hearing dates fall out for notice requirements, but this would be, in terms of a time frame, no different than someone wanting to rezone the land, such as Vicky Pullen did last year, to rezone it from RL to R2. It's the same time frames because it's the same notice requirements and the same process before it gets to hearing.
What do you think it is now?
It's approximately the same, I would say 60 to 90
So
days.
it's pretty similar now
Mhm.
today. Councilmember Meisner.
Page 2, 1740, item A. It says the city may require additional information or details. Historically, it seems like that we've gotten in these predicaments where the city, and I realize that by some interpretation is council, but we didn't do it. The city does additional requirements, and those requirements keep changing. I would like to see some kind of language in there that talks about that those additional requirements are going to be documented in some form of, I don't know, somewhere along the line, we need to document exactly what those additional requirements are. Because historically, we continue to have additional requirements. I'm not saying you, I'm just saying we've dealt with those issues where today it's item A, tomorrow we're adding item B, next time we're doing something, it's item C. It's a never-ending battle with things that keep getting added. How do we address that?
Well, my experience in doing these kinds of PDD applications, particularly for really large-scale projects, is that on occasion it becomes necessary, given the dynamics of a particular site, to have to do some sort of an examination about, is there a 100-year floodplain that goes through the property, and therefore are there sensitive areas that need to be protected? If this is a predominantly residential annexation that isn't coming to the table with potential commercial sites that could generate sales tax revenue, is there some sort of a fiscal impact that could occur to the city? These sorts of things are requirements that staff is advised by the elected body that we want to make sure new development observes this. Now, if you don't want to observe those, that's fine. We wouldn't require them.
That's not the issue. The issue is that, as I'm understanding this, that the application has to be complete.
Yes.
And we're talking about incompleteness here. And I believe that the city has a responsibility to identify those things that are not complete in the application at one time.
Okay.
And not having that be a process that continues to have items added to
So
it.
I understand your concern. What I'm hearing you say is you don't want the city to be put in the, council to be put in the position of having a staff that's suddenly loading on a bunch of requirements that the city has never asked for before onto any particular new project that's coming.
Or just
Not-
discover, not new stuff necessarily, well, new stuff, but just discovering things, oh, we missed this, oh, we didn't review the
So-
100-year flood,
So-
let's.
So
add
there
it on.
is a way to resolve this, and this is a possible resolution. I don't know that I'm necessarily advocating for this, but this is one way that would take care of that concern. And we would say the city may require by written notice additional information or details related to the material, blah, 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 or to complete a thorough review of the applicant's proposal. Only one written notice per PDD is appropriate to apply. I'm not sure exactly how to finish that one, but.
We could get
but-
ourselves into trouble, though. if we-
Well, but I'm saying, that, you're right, because that is very prescriptive, and it says, you staff shall only get one shot at this, only one bite at the apple. You give one written notice, all of your concerns have to be included in that written notice. Once it goes out, then you have to just judge on what comes back, whether it's complete or not.
And then what happens? That's gonna be my
Yeah, I got you,
scenario.
right. So
Yeah.
what if it's incomplete? Well, but.
Mistakes happen.
I think that's all right. The idea is, that the process continues there. That if it's not complete,
I think, John, what I was looking for.
Yeah.
I mean, my notes just say that I want something written in terms of what is missing from the application.
Yeah, and just so I understand, like something written to the applicant or something
Yeah.
written in here?
Well,
Are-
something here and here that says that we're going to give the applicant written notification of those things that are missing, or whatever we're looking for here.
Well, I think that's pretty much what you do now.
That-
Well-
that is definitely what we do. And I will tell you that we also have, and some of you may have noticed upstairs in the lobby, we're beginning to create these development assistance packets. And one of the items the development assistant packet contains for each different kind of application is a list of items that are required in order to be considered a complete application. We typically, when we sit down with an applicant, have one of these packets with us. We go through the submittal requirements for both hard copies and electronic copies of what we need. And then if there's something in particular special that we need because of the context of the piece of property, we will make sure we note on that form what it is that we are asking them to include with the application. And after we've gotten the application in, if we notice that there's something missing, within usually 24 hours, I respond to the applicant and say, you're missing A, B, and C. How quickly can you get those to us?
The
So-
problem is like 2 weeks later, they're like, oh yeah, by the way, now I see D, E, and F. So I don't know if that's something that would be more of an administrative process, or that Ryan would be in charge of making sure that that's taken care of from the first go-around versus actually codifying it, because sometimes A, B, and C does get missed, and you don't want to have some fatal
mean-
flaws in a plan.
I mean, sometimes A, B, and C gets missed, but the other times, sometimes we say A is missing, and they submit A, and A is half done. And so we have to go back and say,
That's not a problem. I mean, I
okay,
don't have
because
a
that's a
problem.
lot of what has happened that I've personally observed.
I've personally observed the other way.
I'm sure you have, and I'm not saying that's not true, but I'm just saying if you codify a process, you better be prepared to be married to it. If it's one notice, that's fine, we can put that in there, but you could have incomplete applications and recommendations from staff for denial because you have incomplete components. And then you're hashing it out in a public meeting, and nobody enjoys that process. So I'm just kind of saying a caveat to giving a hard and fast rule, that's all.
Right.
But we'll put it in there if you guys
Well,
want.
because part of our problems too is that sometimes our parties don't have all the expertise at their hands to bring it back completely with those recommendations. And so it does go through a process to get
Yeah,
there.
I mean,
That's a
ideally.
whole different
Ideally,
strategy too.
in an ideal situation, yes, we would give one notice. But I don't know how many times over my last 4 years we've been here with multiple letters from the city over a period of 6 to 8 months, and each letter identifying different elements that have to be corrected. And you have to tell yourself at what point, why didn't you catch that the first time? So that the individual, I'm not blaming you, so that the individual understands what needs to be corrected and they'll correct it. But they correct A, B, and C and they come back to the city. This has been going on for years. And now we have E, F, and G. And then we have H, I, and J. And it's a never-ending battle with things that the city has decided to need to be corrected to get whatever kind of permit we're working on. And those are the kinds of things, along with the whole complication process, we need to be able to minimize. And I realize that I just don't know how we fix that.
So,
Yeah, if you don't
Yeah,
mind,
go ahead,
you know, I think there's a couple different things to unpack there. You've got, you know, the issue of incomplete submissions, and
Right.
you know, in the
Yes.
past, we've started the review process based off of information that we have received, even though the packet might not be complete. And I think sometimes that might play into some of this confusion where, you know, we're trying to be business friendly and we start the process
Right.
ahead of time because we're reviewing what we have, even though it's not complete. I think, you know, Patrick and, you know, the development review packets that he has put together, which is more or less a checklist, if I'm not mistaken, correct? And, you know, we're trying to create more of these tools that the developers can use as they go through the process to make sure that we are getting those complete applications, so we are reviewing complete applications, because, you know, sometimes, you review certain sections and you know, it's in absence of, you know, maybe it's in absence of E and F, and you receive E and F, and that changes the review comments on item A. So I think part of this is making sure that we have a complete packet and all that information is there before we start some of that review process.
so,
It's
go ahead.
possible, excuse me, thank you. It's possible that the checklist will help fix this problem. Because the difference that I'm hearing is the difference between a requirement and lacking information. Okay, so if the city has a requirement and a developer makes a response and it's not complete, it's entirely appropriate to keep turning the wheel. You know, the issue is, it seems to me, that the issue has been when there are additional requirements that are identified during the review process that are not upfront and not transparent to the developer what the requirements are.
I think generally, a number of contractors would tell you that in terms of trying to meet requirements, it's always a moving target with the city. Because I don't know what I'm going to see in this meeting. So however we fix that, that's what we need to fix.
So, and that's kind of why we're having this meeting now, so we can voice those concerns and we can kind of maybe let staff chew on that a little bit and see what can be done to have a better comfort level for that.
I think if you look at the most recent issues with the northwestern development in the city, we're in the final stages and we still got problems people are saying, why didn't we identify that 6 months ago? So how do we fix those problems? And if the checklist does that, that's good. But it just seems like when they're trying to get something approved and we find out something that a contractor's saying, well, if I'd have known that 6 months ago, I could fix that. And we had that happen right here within the last 6 months, where a contractor's saying, if I'd have known that, I'd have fixed it back
So,
then.
Ryan, do you have a comment?
Well, I think, some of the decoupling of the zoning and the subdivision is going to help some of those issues. And, that's a real, the really big piece of what we're trying to do here is trying to decouple those two items so there are cleaner processes.
And I wonder too, even just the language of the new PDD process is, it's easy, you read it, you know exactly what it says and what it means. I go through the old one, that's 23 pages, and just one little tiny paragraph, my head is spinning like, what in the heck was that supposed to mean? And that can't help matters either.
Exactly.
Brandon Smith.
Well, at the end of the day, this is just streamlining this process until we can get into these titles and completely update it. So this isn't going to be the final, the way I understand it. This is just a Band-Aid until we can get everything redone with grants and such, right? Correct?
Correct.
Well, but he also stated that he intended to roll this into the new 17.
Correct.
So it will be permanent.
Well, I think we'll make that decision when the new 17 is sitting in front of us. I don't want to make any promises that this exact language is going to be in 17. But I think the concepts of streamlining easier language so that like someone can, because I couldn't get through the old section either, and I do it for a living. And so if I can't read it, most people can't read it. And so, that kind of, those concepts is what you saw in your riverfront zoning, it's what you see here. So it's the kind of, that's what we're going to bring forward. Now, whether this exact structure stays in 17, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, because we don't know what we're doing.
And
We don't know exactly what that new 17 is going to look like, so.
And again, it's, with the new 17 and the new comprehensive plan and, this language included, we want to make all of that cohesive. So it's all flowing together and working together as a guide for development and, encouraging development.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick.
Thank you. The other way to say that is that this is a Band-Aid in 17. We've got our requirements in 16, okay? And the issue is that some of the requirements, we believe, are extraordinarily complex and complicated and almost impossible to understand. And because of the expertise of our staff, sometimes they realize those and as they go through an application, all of a sudden the idea says, oh, wait a minute, there's this other requirement here that we have to honor. And so our real problem, this is probably a good step. Our real problem is the complexity in 16. And as we address that, then the issues that we're trying to deal with here probably become less important is what it seems to me.
Well, I don't know what you're gonna say. What I was gonna say is, as you approach, 17 and just thinking about it, I mean, one of the biggest things you're gonna have to think about is how to just structure the whole thing, and how it works. And I think a little bit of what John's alluding to is just that, like, flipping over here, nothing's in the same place, and only staff knows where it is sometimes, and that kind of thing. And so part of one of the goals, I think, should be is to really give a structure that flows for the reader and, like, the average reader.
That it be user-friendly.
User-friendly.
Right,
And
yeah.
if it's pictures and diagrams that gets us there, great. And less text, then that's great. But it's also just structuring it so people are like, oh, all the processes are in one place. This is what I'm doing, and they can just read it, and it's just easy, and rather than flipping around and trying to figure out where things are.
And I think that we did that with riverfront zoning.
I-
I think that we
I think-
achieved that goal in
Absolutely.
riverfront zoning.
Yeah, and Title 8 and 9 too.
Well, I
Council,
wouldn't go that far. Get my vote on that one.
Councilmember Meisner.
I'm just being honest.
No, your name's on here. Do you want to say anything?
Yes. I thought you were admonishing me or something. I'll leave it with this. When the city identifies deficiencies in applications, we should document that in writing. However we do that.
And we do, Patrick sends memos and contacts.
Well, I realize that Patrick does that, but if Patrick moves on to greener pastures tomorrow, the new Patrick may decide that he doesn't want to do that, and there's no requirement for him to do that. And I want there to be a requirement
I think-
that there be written communication to identify the missing elements, particularly 1740A and somewhere else, 1760, where it talks about a complete application. That wherever you don't have a complete application, I think there needs to be written communication with the contractor, whoever we're working with, to identify what is missing.
We totally agree, and I don't want to speak for Ryan, but I can tell you that Patrick has gotten me saying to him, did you write it? Did you memorialize it? Did you send it off to them? Did you explain it all to them? Put it in one thing, put Adam's comments, your comments in one thing. They're not getting something from Adam, something from you, blah, blah, just one piece of paper for them, make it really easy, and memorialize if you had a conversation with them, if you just reviewed the application. So I think we're on the same page as, that's an absolute must-do, in my opinion.
And I agree, and I think rather than codifying it here, I think a better place to put it might be, we have an administrative policies manual. That would be where I would recommend you probably want to make sure you have that statement that it must be memorialized in writing to an applicant.
All right.
Then it becomes at that point, if my replacement next week decides that they're.
Don't say that. You're making me feel really nervous.
Doesn't do that, at that point, it becomes a job evaluation point, that they aren't doing the job that they've been hired to do.
Councilmember Smith.
Well, I was just gonna kind of piggyback off what I said before, where this is a Band-Aid, and then when we get to actually rewriting 17, although we want to be modern with Denver metro area type things, I hear a lot from people in the community about streamlining something between either the county and the city, so that the way that our annexation lines are drawn, you have a subdivision and half of it's county and half of it's city, and there's all these requirements. Can we look at, when we rewrite everything, at what the county's doing for their PDDs, or what Florence is doing, and that way, it doesn't have to be exact language, but that way it's at least similar.
Yeah, I'm saying this out of total ignorance. I have no idea what Florence or the county
Right,
does.
right.
But Florence, I think for sure, I mean, I don't have any idea what they do, and I think it would make sense, it wouldn't be a bad idea to look at, a lot of, not just Florence, but maybe even other local communities kind of in the area. The county is challenging. I don't know if they have a PDD process. Their rules regarding subdivisions and zoning are completely different. And so they're bound by different constraints and those kind of things. But we can no harm in taking a look, but just so you know, the rules are a little different for them.
Yeah, that,
so.
doesn't the state have different requirements for them versus
and I
municipalities
understand
by
that.
state tend to be more strict or have more guidelines?
I understand that. I was just trying to maybe, not, they don't have to be exact, but at least looking at the processes so that
Well,
they're closer.
And another thing we can also do is kind of this comprehensive plan. You know, as part of the comprehensive plan, you're gonna have your 3-mile plan, which is your kind of annexation, growth boundaries and stuff like that. And it's a good time to revisit. I believe there is an urban growth IGA annexation IGA
There
with the
is.
county, but it is a great time to have a conversation with them and start talking about, okay, if you have an application that's right on our boundary and we might want to annex that property, can you send it over to us to see if we want to annex it first so that there is no like weird divide and those properties that are really meant to be urban are getting absorbed into the city? And so
Okay.
it's a great time to revisit that so that you can kind of maybe smooth out those issues a little bit. so.
Awesome.
Any other questions from council? I do have one on page 5, letter F, and this is where it talks about the adequate plans from the police, the fire protection, and emergency medical service. And where in this process do those reports need to be submitted? Is that part of that beginning process where everything's on the same page from the beginning so we can outline all the requirements?
Yes, we get those comments through a referral process. Any new application that we get in gets referred out to various city departments who may have, maybe stakeholders in the review of the process, but also outside agencies such as fire, such as utility providers, including the sanitation district and Black Hills Energy and Atmos. Those comments that we get back in become of record as part of the application, and if their comments are such that there may be a design change needed to be reflected in the application for their interest, we will bring that forward as part of the public hearing, the public record on the project.
Okay. And you say the planning commission, these fine folks in the audience, are they going to be talking about this tonight?
They are.
And so, after they talk about it tonight, then what?
It comes back to you at your first meeting in February
Okay.
for first reading.
So, every time you can take a code from 23 pages to 5 with simple language that anybody can understand with flowcharts, let's do it. I love seeing this. It's really exciting. Makes me really happy. So, I'd
Should
love
have
to
been
see.
4.
You can't go too simple, else you're going to go into chaos. But,
That's an assumption.
but thank you. I really enjoyed
Thanks, Patrick.
having this. And this is for the tenured Patrick and not any new Patricks. Don't even make those insinuations. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
This meeting is adjourned.